Hey, my name is Michał Zieliński, and I will be talking about building large-scale websites and apps that are based on Jamstack. For this talk, I wanted to focus on a more general overview rather than particular case studies or technologies. I will be sharing some of my experiences I had as a developer at an agency working for clients that operate outside of the ordinary scale. So, to make it a bit more precise, the term large scale might sound a bit mysterious at first, and I think it might be a good idea to start here. I've listed a bunch of examples of what I have in mind specifically. In general, we are looking at projects with a lot of content that are more complex technically and rely on broader non-technical teams. It's also important to note that it's not uncommon for projects that are larger in scale to combine different purposes. So for example, a lot of times you will see e-commerce websites that will also include a blog functionality for content marketing purposes. The main difference when it comes to those large-scale projects, to me, is the amount of people involved, the amount of stakeholders that have an influence on the project, and that have to be taken into account when architecting the project, but also during the development phase itself, and then during the maintenance as well, of course. Though, how does Jamstack help? How does it fit here? Why is it good to use Jamstack for those large-scale projects? So with monolithic architecture, you'd usually find yourself quite constrained. And Jamstack gives you a way out. You can combine different data sources with incredible ease. And this is the main advantage to me. For example, Gatsby makes it really easy to make different content management systems, CRM systems like HubSpot or Salesforce, and create a very seamless experience for the end user. As mentioned previously, in cases of projects like this, you will very often have very different teams that are split across the company, and each and every one of them has its own specific needs. So, for example, an HR team might prefer to work in Lever, and you as a front-end development team are able to deliver a native-like experience for the end user. All this happening simultaneously to the content team working in, for example, a headless WordPress instance. I don't think the last point needs a lot of explanation. But I think this is also something quite important to note with Jamstack-based projects. This is often a winning argument when you try to convince your client or your manager that the approach will benefit the project. No matter how large your website becomes or how much traffic you start getting, handling scale with Jamstack requires much less effort. This isn't the case of WordPress, for example, where you would have to scale a physical or a virtual server with CDNs, with serverless services, with managed services. Those are all abstracted, so it's not really as much of a problem. An important question we have to ask ourselves is how to figure out a good approach to build a large-scale website with Jamstack. Most importantly, and I can't stress this enough, make sure you thoroughly understand the project. its quirks, its needs, make sure you understand your user's perspective, how they work, what they would like to have. If there is an existing solution you are replacing, figure out what works and what doesn't, because maybe the existing solution that the stakeholders are using is actually enough and it's good. It doesn't need fixing. Don't fixate on a single stack. Research your options. For some projects, for example, Gatsby, Headless, WordPress, and Netlify might work best. For others, it will be Next, Contentful, and Cloudflare Pages, for example. The truth is, possibilities are endless, but you have to know your options. Research well-established solutions, but also look into the nuance. Think about mixing them and creating something that works for your team. So make sure that before jumping into the actual implementation, you have had enough time to experiment with your chosen tools. And this can be done primarily by prototyping. Create prototypes and present them to non-technical teams that will use them. Get as much feedback from them as possible. Prototypes are also a great way to understand weak spots of particular stacks and will help you eventually find a better or the best solution that will fit the needs of your team in a fitting manner. So how do you find tools that will work in cases like this? How do you find a tool that will facilitate hundreds of pages and that will cater to all those individual needs? And the truth is, it's usually, the answer is usually staying practical, staying very pragmatic and minimal. Usually the most simple solution works best, and this is also the case with large websites. With the current state of Jamstack and JavaScript development, it's quite easy to get fixated on the latest and greatest React-based frameworks or the latest headless CMS that just came out and gains so much popularity. And while it's always fun to experiment with new stuff, when it comes to those large-scale projects that need reliability, maybe going for something that's already well-tested and established is a much better way than going for something that hasn't been around for a long time. So to illustrate this, we could use an example of choosing a CMS for a project. Not always do you have to stray away from WordPress. Drupal or another content management system that might seem slightly outdated. Both WordPress and Drupal can be used with Jamstack projects as they expose REST APIs that you can fetch data from, that you can manipulate the data through, and do all sorts of things that, you use only the CMS, the traditionally monolithic CMS, to source data without really having to fall into this this architecture of HTML templates and so on and so on. So if you are migrating a project that's already based on one of those, instead of replacing the entire stack, only replace the front end. Don't fix something that doesn't need fixing. A lot of people that are involved in web projects already have their preferred ways of working, their established workflows that do not need changing, that work very well and help maintain the good quality of the overall project, the overall look and feel of the website. Oftentimes, introducing new things like new technologies, new tools will be detrimental in this area. And this is often the case with larger blogs. Content teams have established workflows that work well for them. And I guess that while for us as developers, it might not be our favorite approach, this usually will be the best way to go around it rather than changing everything from the ground up. So the second point is to choose managed solutions over self-maintained. And once again, for us as developers, it's quite easy to get sucked into like the spiral of reinventing the wheel, of getting fixated on creating a custom solution. But most likely you are able to use something that's already there. And even if it doesn't fit all the criteria, you maybe can talk to the stakeholders and convince them that it's a better choice in the long run. When implementing new features, you are able to use a managed service. This will not only help you save a lot of time, but you also will not be bothered with maintenance as much. And this also applies to choosing services you use to deliver your project to the end user. Using services like Netlify or Vercel can help you abstract a lot of work and effort. Normally, you'd need to set up a CDN or something like this, even if you used Amazon or a cloud provider like this. There's much more configuration needed. There is much more work to be done. If you go towards a managed platform that abstracts all of this, you will have more time to focus on your product, on the features that the users request. It will be just much easier for you to focus on the code rather than the infrastructure. Another important thing that we've learned is to leverage serverless as much as possible. So basically, any cloud managed services are good because they are managed, and that's about it. The third point being focus on business goals. Put business goals first. Maintaining good performance, for example, is quite important, but fulfilling business objectives should always be the priority. Not everything has to be executed perfectly development-wise. So you might have a website that loads in a split second, but doesn't really fulfill all the lead generation goals and so on and so on. Or, for example, as I've mentioned previously, does not really cater to the needs of your content management team. So try to listen as much as possible to not just your management, to your business oriented team, but also try to listen to the sort of like the people, the stakeholders that are involved in the project. Make sure they are on board, because the quality of the website and the project is much reliant on them. So, as I mentioned before, with those larger projects, you will have to balance between different functionalities. But not everything has to be a single large front end. In fact, the micro front-end approach that has been gaining a lot of popularity recently is quite fitting in those cases. When you have to combine a blog and e-commerce shop, perhaps something more interactive, like a simple dashboard, something behind an auth gate, you will find yourself creating a single large front-end that perhaps grows a bit too complex. So the solution here that works very well are micro frontends, and Jamstack is no exception to the approach being quite fitting in cases of perhaps maybe more modular, more complex websites, more complex projects. But what does it mean really? So each one of those components, the blog, the shop, for example, the careers section, could be its own individual app maintained by an individual team or individual developers. Each of those front ends could be hosted on a subdomain, and using a router or redirects, you can facilitate all of those components, those front-end components, those front-ends microservices under a single top-level domain. And you could use a managed service for this purpose. So for example, Netlify to host each of those micro front-ends as a separate project, and then have another separate project to combine all of those. And you can actually use a managed service to do something like this. There is a possibility to do something like this with Netlify's redirect feature, where you could have, for example, a /blog slug that actually points to something completely different, to a completely different app. So same thing applies to content sources. And as I've mentioned previously, in my experience, it's best not to store everything in a single large bucket, because this way you will probably start to lose a grip on how to manage everything in a sane way. Another thing to consider in this point is that each CMS has its own quirks and can facilitate to different purposes. So for example, when you're working with blog pages, perhaps Netlify CMS might be the best idea. If you're working with products, if you're working with e-commerce stuff, Contentful might be the best thing to use there. For landing pages, you could use Storyblok, and you can combine all of those different content management systems to actually create a single thing that will then seamlessly integrate into a single product, and the end users will not be able to differentiate which one is actually responsible for which portion of the website. But in reality, this will help a lot your content management team, your product management team, and so on. So another thing to note is also to leverage those different CI/CD platforms, but also cloud services, to find something that works in your specific case. So you might want to use Netlify as the deployment platform, but also use Gatsby Cloud as the build/staging/development platform. This way, you can leverage advantages of different platforms while simultaneously using all of them to create a single better product. So how to maintain quality? Because you have to somehow manage hundreds of pages in projects like this. And when you have all of those pages and a significant amount of traffic, it's quite hard to stay on top of things. Bugs happen, and chances are that you will never be able to ship something that is completely bug-free to your production environment. What you can do, though, is to try to limit this as much as possible. And here are some things that have worked for us. Consider your target browsers and test accordingly. And this means using tools like BrowserStack, for example, to test all the browsers that you need to be targeting if everything works correctly, and using regression testing for automated tests on all of those different environments to make sure each and every one of those environments works as expected. When it comes to the very core, the code base, the quality assurance really starts here. As much as TypeScript can be long discussed by developers, I believe that it helps maintain consistency, but also helps eliminate bugs at a very early stage. Another thing to note with TypeScript is that it helps onboard new developers to the project very quickly. It helps them understand the code base and makes it quite easy for them to start writing new functionalities. Make sure you maintain good test suite. And I'm not just talking about unit testing. Make sure you write extensive end-to-end tests, because this way you can probably avoid a lot of issues that might only pop up at a later stage. So I also wanted to quickly jump into some case studies, some projects that we have worked on as an agency at Bijamas. One of the largest projects that we have worked on was Mambu. In this case, there was hundreds of pages and numerous teams that have been involved into the project. Some things that we have learned from this was the quality assurance, were the quality assurance points that I have just discussed. It's quite important to make sure that you keep quality as good as possible from the start on. Write unit tests from the very beginning. Make sure you cover the entire code base with tests. Write end-to-end tests, use regression testing. This way you can probably avoid the end user reporting some bugs and avoid mistakes. In this case, we have used Gatsby, TypeScript, and Sanity. In addition to that, there is also Lever involved, Salesforce, HubSpot, and all the different services that normally would have been quite hard to combine, but with Gatsby, it was quite easy. And actually, the site was very performant. It still is, despite the fact that it's so complex. Though generally speaking, if it wasn't for Jamstack, if it wasn't for Gatsby, chances are that it would have grown out of control. And another case study that I also wanted to discuss was Backlinko, which is one of the largest SEO-related blogs. And in this case, the customer approached us asking to create a new front end. They wanted to keep the WordPress instance they had as the CMS. And this is something that I've also described previously, that very often the established workflows with content are enough. You don't really need to make any changes to improve things. They are already good. So we've used the WordPress instance that they had as headless CMS, and used Next to facilitate the migration to Jamstack further. In this case, the migration was also very successful, and I think the client was quite happy with it. They were able to leverage all those different goodies that Jamstack offers, so lazy loading and so on, while keeping their preferred CMS as the content source. Thank you for listening. I hope you've gained some insight into projects like that. Ask a lot of questions to your clients, to me as well, hopefully. gather as much feedback as possible, plan as much as possible, and let's stay in touch. I've linked my own Twitter in this slide, but also come visit our company Twitter. Also, maybe follow us on Instagram, and I hope to hear and answer some of the questions that might have popped up in your heads during my presentation.
Great presentation, Michał. And thanks again for joining us all the way from Poland. So we did get a couple of audience questions. I'm going to go through those, and then I had a few questions myself. So first of all, we get from Billy, what solutions are there for CMSs that auto-trigger a build when content changes? Is there anything that will show changes right away so they don't have to wait for a rebuild?
Yeah, so in our case, for example, the Mambu presentation, we have been using Sanity, as mentioned in the presentation. And for Sanity, there's a really nice plugin for Gatsby that also works with WebSockets. So you don't really have to use like rebuild each time you want to preview the changes, but you can very simply use, for example, Gatsby Cloud, or set up your own server that will show the changes right away. And when it comes to like triggering changes, I think this is something that most CMSs have built in. But for large pages where you'd like to give your editors the ability to preview content right away, I think a plugin with WebSockets such as the Gatsby source Sanity is the best option.
Okay, so that plugin would allow you to do that. Does it have to work with Gatsby Cloud or something like that, or is it something you can use and set up on your own?
No, not really. You can use it with whichever server you might have on hand. We have set up this plugin on DigitalOcean VPS that's costs $5 per month, so it's really not that expensive to have a real-time preview for the editors. It's something that you can set up very quickly. You don't really have to use a managed service. Obviously, in the presentation, I said that the best option would be to use a managed service, and I stand by that. But if a client has these specific needs to allow the editors, whichever team they might be in, to preview changes live, I guess you can set up something like this on your own as well.
Sure. Have you ever? I'm curious. Have you ever used StackBit for that purpose, or no?
No, we haven't really used StackBit. But I guess StackBit would be used for like smaller websites, perhaps.
Okay, I mean, because I know it has the preview built in on StackBit, so that's why I was curious if you tried it for that purpose. But okay, cool. All right, next question was: do WordPress third-party components data will be included in the WordPress REST API? Okay, I get it. So is the third-party component data included in the REST API on WordPress?
To be honest, I'm not entirely sure. I think that, for example, the Gatsby plugin will not include external plugins and the GraphQL schema.
Okay, it doesn't include. Okay, but in my own experience with at least some of these plugins, like because the WordPress API will send you rendered HTML, it actually will include anything that like actually alters the rendering of your page, but I don't know if it actually gives you the third-party data either. Okay. Next question is: how many pages qualifies as a large Jamstack? How many pages is too many for Jamstack to handle?
So I don't really think that there is such thing as too many, because you can use different techniques with websites that grow like thousands of pages. You could use Next.js, for example, and not have everything pre-built, rather use server-side rendering on the fly, and this way you get a nice pre-rendered HTML markup while still having a website that does not take forever to build. To answer the first question, how many pages qualifies a large Jamstack site? Like a couple hundred, I guess. In our experience, it's not really about the number of pages. It's more like about the process and the people involved, because you might have a lot of pages, but just the architecture is not complex enough to qualify this as a large thing.
Right. So like, it's not really specifically about the pages, because I could have like a blog that has thousands of pages, but it's not complex, right? You wouldn't. It's not.
Yeah,
I don't think you would
exactly.
encounter a lot of the enterprise issues that you talk about, which seems to be that what you said was a lot of the issues are really about having to deal with multiple teams. Like I know I'm not just dealing with the developer who's building the site. I'm also having to deal with the marketing team who's going to edit the site, and the infrastructure team who's managing how this gets deployed and things like that. It's a lot of more. It's almost like people management as much as it is code management.
Yeah, it's sort of like the being put in between technical, the technical team, and sort of like having to work with non-technical people that might not always understand Jamstack. We had cases when clients weren't exactly convinced to Jamstack, so we had to individually translate like what benefits Jamstack brings to them, to all the non-technical people, because you might have, for example, a marketing team that is like, why would we want to use Jamstack? The old setup that we had with whatever was great. So you sort of like had to put yourself in their shoes, explain these things, help them build a workflow that will work with your desired tech stack. Yeah, that's about it.
Right. So actually, that leads to another question I had, which is, so obviously you have to kind of sell these groups on it. What do you use to sell like an enterprise on the benefits of Jamstack? What are the things that you think are the key selling points to a large company considering?
So it's usually about PowerPoint presentations. We have a couple of these things internally at Pyjamas. Sort of like comparisons between WordPress and monolithic architectures and Jamstack, whatever the tech stack choice might be in a particular case of a website. But it's usually about speed, the simplicity. Usually performance is a big selling point for all stakeholders. Just giving them the idea that the website will load fast on all devices is usually enough to convince them.
And you mentioned like, and I love the quote from your session. Don't fixate on a single stack, right? I think that's absolutely true within, and one of the benefits of Jamstack is you have a lot of options, right? But how, number one, I would say it's kind of a two-part questions. How do you determine what that stack should be for any given company? And like, do you have basic? Are you guys going with like a clean slate, or you have like, here are the things we kind of recommend you go to?
So it really depends on like case-to-case basis, because like all those individual needs that each client has will usually dictate the chosen stack. Some clients will have some specific needs that will be better matched by, for example, Gatsby and Contentful, and other clients will have needs that will be better solved with Next and something else. Like, for example, the real-time preview problem that a lot of things that a lot of companies will request. Like, for example, Storyblock is a CMS that allows for that very easily. But obviously, each case has to be analyzed and investigated individually. We have some preferred CMS's preferred frameworks. So we suggest things, but we try to be as custom as possible.
It makes sense. Okay, so a couple other quick questions from the audience. I see that Mambu is a big website. Did you implement any personalization, and if so, what type?
I'm not sure I understand personalization very well, but we did work with the CMS quite extensively, where some features requested by Mambu specifically were implemented with, for example, their structure builder. Sanity offers some tools to customize the dashboard, which is quite helpful when a client approaches you and says, I would like to have this and that done. Sometimes ACMS will not allow you to manipulate the user interface. In this specific case, and this is why Sanity was chosen in the first place, there is an option to manipulate the user interface itself, or you can add some features that the client might request on the go as well.
Okay, yeah, and I think he meant, I'm suspecting by personalization he meant like user personalization, like being able to customize some, like either favorite certain content or or add user details and things like that. Did you do any of that on that site, or was it straight content presentation?
So since this is an enterprise website, you don't really have any features such as my favorite corporate article or anything like this. But we did work quite extensively with Google Analytics and marketing tools. We had a bunch of issues there because obviously the GDPR stuff was getting in the way of what the client wanted. And we had to find some solutions there. But generally speaking, I believe that no features like that were implemented.
Okay. And last question from Linus. How do you convince stakeholders to go for Jamstack solutions versus an enterprise CMS such as SharePoint or Sitecore?
To be honest, it's always hard to convince people that are already very into the enterprise tools, such as SharePoint, for example, that they should pick something more novel. Like even with the most established things in the Jamstack area, you have some. So, for example, Contentful. This is not enough usually to convince some of the most the biggest enthusiasts of those all of those enterprise solutions such as SharePoint. But yeah, as mentioned in the presentation and then in the QA session, usually the very selling points of Jamstack that I mentioned previously, such as performance, the speed, but also the ability to integrate different services besides the single enterprise solution that they might have in mind is enough. When people approach and say that perhaps WordPress, like the monolithic WordPress architecture, might be better, we usually come up with arguments such as, well, it doesn't scale very well, and I think SharePoint also doesn't scale very well. You can really combine it with something different. But it's always nice to investigate if perhaps you cannot use those enterprise tools that companies already have in place to combine them with something more, something fresh. So try to combine HubSpot, for example, which is slightly more established solution for like people that work in large companies. Keep some portions of the contents in Contentful, for example, in a more Jamstack compatible CMS, and then still allow them to use the enterprise solution they might like.
Yeah. I had spent some time in a marketing department at a fairly large company, and I would say that, my perspective on that is, number one, they tend to look at what other companies that they compete with are doing. So if they're all on WordPress, it's like, well, why would we do anything but WordPress? Look at so and so and so and so. They're all doing WordPress, and oftentimes I found it's the marketing, like these projects. The marketing department is the one that holds the budget for it. So it's trying to find ways to convince those marketers that this is the right choice, even though they're not into the technical underpinnings of it. But you have to give them come up with marketing reasons that sell them, because they're ones funding it to the team that's actually going to be in charge of building it and things like that. At least that's my personal experience. But anyway, really grateful for your time here, Michal. It's been great, and I hope, thank you for coming.